My name is Maurice Rivers. I am 36 years old, and for most of my adult life I held one belief with the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need to announce itself. If you build something real, something that solves a problem nobody else is willing to touch, the world will eventually make room for it. That belief cost me my marriage. Or maybe it saved me. 3 years later, I'm still working that out. What I know for certain is this. On a Tuesday evening in October, in the marble lobby of a private event space just off Camelback Road in Scottsdale, Arizona, my wife stood in front of 200 people, pulled her wedding ring from her finger, and threw it hard onto the floor. Hard enough that I heard it bounce 3 times before it came to rest against the baseboard. Then she told me I was worthless. What none of those 200 people knew, what she didn't know, was that 48 hours earlier, a federal program officer had left a voicemail on my phone that was about to change everything I had spent 3 years building in silence. I hadn't told a soul, not even my mother, and I had almost not picked up. The evening had begun the way those evenings always began, with me already feeling like I was wearing the wrong shoes to the right party. The event was a professional networking reception hosted by a coalition of Black business leaders across the Phoenix metro. The kind of room where the suits cost more than my monthly workshop lease, and the conversation moved like a current you were either swimming with or quietly drowning in. My wife had been circling the space for 20 minutes before I'd even found the coat check. She moved through rooms like that naturally, like water finding its level. Jamila Harper Rivers, 34. Light brown skin, sharp cheekbones, silk-pressed hair that caught the chandelier light every time she turned her head. She was the director of public relations for one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the Southwest, the daughter of a well-connected Scottsdale family, and she looked every inch of all of it that night. Fitted black dress, small gold earrings, heels that clicked across the floor like a metronome keeping time with the room's ambitions. I wore the best suit I owned, navy, slightly shiny at the elbows. I had pressed it myself that morning in my mother's kitchen in South Phoenix, standing at the ironing board with a borrowed iron and a shirt that needed 2 slow passes before it would lie flat. I mention that because it matters, because that is what 3 years of building a water filtration prototype in a workshop on East University Drive in Tempe, mostly alone and mostly broke, will do to a man's wardrobe. The project was mine, a low-cost modular filtration system designed for communities facing drought-related water safety crises across southern Arizona. Entire neighborhoods in South Phoenix where children were getting sick from aging pipes. Elderly residents on fixed incomes buying bottled water every week because what came out of the tap frightened them. I had been building a system that could solve that problem for a fraction of what commercial alternatives cost. Documenting everything in composition notebooks, testing components on weekends, running numbers at my mother's kitchen table after she went to bed. I had been building it while my marriage quietly eroded around me. A man approached me near the drinks table. Gray temples, practiced handshake, the confident posture of someone who had been networking since before I was in high school. He asked about my work. Jamila had apparently mentioned it to someone, which surprised me. I told him the truth. Filtration units at under $200 per household installation. Early testing in South Phoenix community gardens. Strong preliminary results for communities that had been managing without clean water for years. There was a small silence after I finished. A soft laugh from somewhere to my left. Someone used the word brave the way people use it when they mean something closer to naive. I looked at my wife. I saw the expression I had been watching spread across her face for the better part of a year. A tightening around the jaw, a particular stillness behind the eyes. Not anger, something more private than anger. The embarrassment of a woman who had decided what her life was supposed to look like and was standing in the moment when it refused to comply. We stepped into the hallway. The party sounds softened behind us. Her voice, when it came, was low and pulled tight. "Maurice, I can't keep doing this. I started to answer, and then her phone buzzed in her hand, short, insistent, and before she could turn the screen, I caught the name. Patrick. The message was 11 words. You okay? I'm close by if you need anything tonight. She locked the screen in one motion. Something shifted briefly in her face, half a second, then gone. I said nothing. I filed it in the part of my mind where I kept the things that didn't add up yet. That drawer had been getting full for a while. And then, in front of a hallway slowly filling with departing guests, she told me her father had been right about me all along. That a man without stability wasn't a real man. That she had given me 10 years. Then she pulled off the ring. It hit the marble and jumped. Once. Twice. 3 times. Each sound smaller than the last, until the thing came to rest against the baseboard and the entire lobby went completely still. You are good for nothing, Maurice. I want you out of the house tonight. She said it at a volume designed to carry, and it carried to every corner of that room. A security guard walked me to my car. By the time I reached it, the rain had started. One of those flat, steady Arizona rains that soaks you before you've thought to reach for a jacket. I sat with both hands on the steering wheel and let the full weight of it press down on me. And I thought about that voicemail, the one I hadn't told her about. I didn't know yet who Patrick was. I didn't know what Jamila had signed or what her family had been quietly doing to me for years, or how deep the architecture of interference actually ran. I didn't know any of it yet, but I was about to find out. Stay close, because what Maurice discovered about Patrick and that text message is the moment this whole story begins to crack wide open. My mother, Layla Rivers, is 68 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and the most economical, wise person I have ever known. She does not use 3 words when one will carry the weight. When I showed up at her door in South Phoenix at 11:30 that night, 2 suitcases, a prototype and a duffel bag, rain still damp in my collar. She studied me for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked to the linen closet, pulled out the good blanket, the thick one she kept for company, and held it out without a word. Then, "You did everything you could, baby. Now get some rest." That was all. No questions about Jamila or the ring or the 200 people who had watched it bounce across a marble floor in Scottsdale. Just a blanket and permission to stop holding myself together for one night. I slept on her pull-out couch beneath a quilt that smelled like cedar and old fabric softener. For the first time in months, I did not wake up at 3 in the morning with my jaw clenched. The next morning, she made eggs. She didn't ask me anything until I'd finished. Then she set a cup of coffee on the table and placed a small USB drive beside it. "Your father wanted you to have this when the time was right," she said. "I think the time is right." My father, Thomas Rivers, had died 4 years earlier. A quiet man who spent 31 years maintaining the infrastructure systems that kept Phoenix running, and his last decade trying to help his son build something new. I had known he believed in the project. I had not known how far that belief had taken him. The USB held an audio recording, a meeting between my father and a private investor, a black entrepreneur in the Phoenix Metro who had expressed serious early interest in funding the filtration work. The recording was 4 years old, made approximately 8 months before my father passed. The investor's interest was genuine. His capital was committed in principle. And then, on the recording, there was a pause. The investor said, carefully, that he had received some communication from a family with standing in the Scottsdale community. The message? The project wasn't viable. The founder, meaning me, wasn't reliable. Backing the work would reflect poorly on everyone involved. My father's voice on that recording was the steadiest I had ever heard it. "Son, whoever told you that was wrong, and they knew they were wrong when they said it." The funding never came through. My father never told me why. Here is something I have come to understand about that morning, sitting at my mother's kitchen table with that USB in my hand. Psychologists describe a pattern called covert undermining, the systematic removal of a person's opportunities, credibility, and resources, executed quietly enough that the target cannot name what is happening to them. The damage is compound. First, you lose the opportunity. Then, because you cannot identify the source of the interference, you begin to suspect the problem is you. You rework your designs. You question your instincts. You tell yourself you just need to work harder. That recording told me I had been running in a room where someone had quietly removed half the oxygen before I walked in. The grief that comes with that understanding is a specific kind. Not the clean grief of a direct loss, but the murkier kind that arrives when you realize the story you built around your own failure was never fully true. 3 days passed. I barely left the house. I played the recording twice more, and then put the USB in my pocket and kept it there. Then Rodney called. Rodney Brooks is my first cousin and the oldest friend I have in the world. He runs an auto repair shop on South Central Avenue. Bays always full, music always on, grease on his forearms before most people have finished breakfast. He drove over without asking why. He sat down at my mother's table, and I played him the recording. He listened without moving. Then he looked at the table for a moment, before he told me something he'd been sitting on for 18 months. About a year and a half earlier, he had quietly swapped some components in my prototype, cheaper parts, because I was running out of money and he thought he was helping bridge the gap. He hadn't fully understood the engineering tolerances involved. He'd meant well. I could hold that part without too much difficulty. Then he told me why he'd stayed silent about it. The Harper family reached out through an associate, he said. Twice. The message was plain. Stop supporting Maurice or they'd reopen the zoning dispute on the shop. I asked him what zoning dispute. He told me. 3 years before Jamila and I were married, Rodney had a property boundary conflict with the city that threatened to shut his father's shop down. A Harper family associate had quietly helped make it go away. Rodney hadn't known at the time who was behind the favor. When the family called it in, he understood. They told me if I kept helping you, they'd go back to the city and finish what they started. I stood to lose everything my father built. He didn't dress it up. I made a calculation. I believed you were going to lose the workshop regardless. I thought I was being practical. I was wrong. That's on me. I looked at my cousin across the table. This man who had shown up every time I called, who had driven across Phoenix at 7 in the morning without requiring an explanation. And I understood that loyalty is not the absence of fear. It is what you do when the fear has already arrived. Rodney had failed that test once. He was at this table now. I held both things. Then he said, "You know about Patrick Osai?" I knew the name. I'd seen it on Jamila's screen at the Scottsdale event. I'd filed it. Her father introduced them at a family dinner about 2 years before y'all split, Rodney said. The way I heard it, Osei was who the family had in mind for her from the beginning. The relationship never went where the family wanted it to, but he was always around. I sat with that for a while. The text message, 11 words. Close by if you need anything tonight. Here is what I decided that morning. Patrick Osei belonged in the record. He told me something true about the architecture of what had been built around my marriage. Another piece of the picture I hadn't been allowed to see clearly. But he wasn't the center of what had been done to me. The center was the systematic removal of every resource that might have let me succeed on my own terms. Patrick was a symptom of that. The disease was something older and more deliberate. I let him take his place in the record, and I moved on. 3 weeks after that kitchen table conversation, the largest prototype failed. The pressure valve cracked. The filtration chamber collapsed. 2 components had been improperly seated, a consequence, in part, of the cheaper parts Rodney had substituted 18 months earlier under pressure he couldn't name to me at the time. The bank sent a notice the same week, 90 days before they would move on the workshop lease. That evening, I sat in my car in the parking lot outside the Tempe space and watched the sun go down over the South Mountain Preserve, that deep Arizona orange that has no equivalent anywhere else. I let myself feel the full weight of it. The recording, Rodney's confession, the failed valve, the bank notice, the years. Then my phone rang. Mrs. Caldwell, 71 years old, South Phoenix. I'd installed a small test unit in her community garden on West Rosa Road 3 weeks before. A single unit, running quiet, almost as an act of stubbornness. "Baby, I don't know who you are or how you did what you did, but my grandbaby drank water from her own tap this morning without getting sick. I just needed somebody to know that." The quiet kind of crying. The kind that doesn't ask for anything back. I did not let the project go. But I didn't know, sitting in that parking lot, that a document with my wife's signature on it had already been drafted years earlier, carefully constructed, waiting for exactly the right moment, and that someone who had helped build that document was about to decide he'd carried it long enough. Before you keep watching, one question. If you found out that the person you loved had unknowingly handed her family a legal weapon pointed at your future, would you call that betrayal? Or a mistake? Drop yes or no below, or tell me your own story. Because what Maurice finds in the next email changes everything he thought he understood about his marriage. And it starts with $40,000 he never knew was a trap. The bank's 90-day notice gave me room to work. I used every day of it. With 2 engineers I had connected with through a South Phoenix infrastructure working group, I rebuilt the core filtration unit over 7 days in Rodney's shop on South Central Avenue. Because the Tempe workshop lease had been surrendered to the bank that Thursday morning, and I had decided that fact would not be the end of anything. The rebuilt unit went into the ground at Mrs. Caldwell's community garden on West Rosa Road on a Saturday. By Monday, it was performing above every benchmark I had projected. I stood in that garden at sunrise with a tablet in my hand, reading the output numbers, and felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled in years. Not triumph, quieter than triumph. The feeling of a thing finally becoming what it was always supposed to be, not because the conditions cooperated, but in spite of the fact that they never had. Mrs. Caldwell brought out 2 folding chairs and a thermos of coffee. We sat between the raised beds while the morning came in pale and cool. "People out here stopped expecting anybody to fix this," she said. "That's the worst part. Not the water itself, the giving up." I thought about that, about what it costs a community or a person to stop expecting things to get better. Psychologists call it learned helplessness, the state that sets in when someone experiences enough uncontrollable setbacks that they stop trying, not because the problem is unsolvable, but because they've been conditioned to believe their efforts cannot change the outcome. It doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, failure by failure, obstacle by obstacle, until the person stops, not because they were defeated in one blow, but because the air ran out. Mrs. Caldwell was describing an entire neighborhood in that state, and she was describing, without knowing it, what had almost happened to me. That afternoon, I returned the call I had been sitting on for weeks, Dr. Angela Merritt, program officer with the EPA's Regional Infrastructure Division out of San Francisco. She had been tracking community-based water solutions across the Southwest for 2 years. Someone had forwarded her a summary of my project, a 2-page overview she wouldn't tell me the source of, though I had my suspicions. We spoke for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She asked precise questions, and listened with the focused patience of someone who had learned to distinguish a good-sounding idea from something actually built and tested. At the end, she said, "Mr. Rivers, I'd like to schedule a site visit. I think your system qualifies for our pilot partnership program, potentially 3 counties." "When can you come?" I said. She came 3 weeks later with 2 colleagues. 4 hours in that garden. Every notebook I had, every failed iteration, and what it had taught me. When she left, she shook my hand and said, "We'll be in touch within 30 days. They were in touch in 12. Then the email arrived. It came from a man named Gerald Watkins. He had spent 3 years as outside counsel for Jamila's employer and, before that, for the Harper family's private interests. He had been present in the room when a particular document was drafted, a document involving my wife, and had raised objections at the time. He had been overruled. He had kept the file. When the family was recently replaced by a larger firm, Watkins found himself holding that file, with no obligation to protect it any further. He wrote that he had a professional responsibility he'd been carrying too long, that the Forbes researcher who'd been given my name had triggered something he could no longer quietly sit on. And then he described what he had watched be put in front of Jamila 6 years ago. During the early years of our marriage, the Harper family had made a series of transfers into the joint household account that Jamila and I shared. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, totaling just above $40,000 across 3 years. At the time, Jamila had told me it was family support, help with living costs while I built the project. I had accepted it without asking too many questions, because we needed it and because I trusted her. The document she had signed recharacterized those transfers as a structured loan to the household. Under its terms, the loan converted to a 25% equity stake in any commercial venture I launched using household resources during the marriage. The household resources included our joint account. The joint account had funded the first workshop lease. The first workshop lease was where the prototype was built. The agreement was aggressive and almost certainly unenforceable in a direct challenge. Watkins said so. But likely unenforceable and legally harmless are not the same thing. It would take attorneys and time and money I was only beginning to have, and it had been drafted precisely to be expensive to fight. I read the email 4 times. On the 5th pass, I stopped reading and sat very still. My father had tried to get me independent funding 4 years ago. If that funding had come through, I would never have needed the joint account. I would never have touched a dollar with the Harper name attached to it. That was the point. That had always been the point. What I felt in that moment was not what I expected. Anger came, but what arrived first, underneath the anger, before it, was something closer to exhausted recognition. The sensation of a puzzle you've been working for years finally revealing that several of its pieces had been face down the entire time. Psychologists have a term for what I had been living through without knowing it: systemic gaslighting. Not the simple kind, where one person distorts your reality, but the structural kind, where the environment itself has been quietly managed by outside hands until you begin to doubt your own capacity, your own judgment, your own worth. You don't recognize it while it's happening, because nothing looks like sabotage from inside it. It just looks like your own limitations. Jamila had not been acting in isolation. She had been operating inside a set of invisible constraints: a legal document, family pressure, the long reach of a household that measured a man by his income and his timeline. And every conversation we ever had about money, about the project, about whether I was enough, had been shaped by that architecture in ways neither of us fully understood at the time. That does not erase her responsibility. She made choices. But it reframes the central question. The question is not simply, why did she leave? The question is, what was she afraid would happen if she stayed? And the answer had been written into a document she signed at 29, at her parents' dinner table, almost certainly without a lawyer of her own present. What I did not know, what I would not learn until Jamila told me herself months later, was that she had known about the equity threat for 3 weeks before it was formally activated. She had been in the room when her father briefed the family attorneys after the Forbes article ran. She had sat at that table and listened to a plan that had been waiting, patient, and precisely constructed for exactly the kind of news that was now moving through the right channels in Phoenix, San Francisco, and Washington. She had not spoken during the meeting. She had driven home and sat in her car for a long time. Then she had called Gerald Watkins. She had asked him to reach out to me before her family could move. She didn't know if I would listen. She sent him anyway. That is why the email arrived before the legal notice did. Not because Watkins acted on conscience alone. Because my wife, for the first time in years, had made a choice that was not the one her family would have made for her. I didn't know that yet, standing in Mrs. Caldwell's garden, with my tablet and my morning coffee and the best output numbers I had ever seen. But it matters to the story. It matters to who she was underneath the person she had been performing. Don't go anywhere. Because when that Forbes article went live and Maurice's phone wouldn't stop ringing, one of the first calls came from the last person he expected. And what she said in that call is the moment this story turns from a betrayal into something far more complicated. The Forbes piece ran on a Thursday. I found out the way you find out when something has shifted irrevocably, not with ceremony, but with a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing before 6 in the morning while I was standing in my mother's kitchen trying to drink my first cup of coffee in peace. The headline called me "The Quiet Engineer Rewriting Water Access in the American Southwest." The photograph was taken in Rodney's shop, me at a workbench, not looking at the camera. It was the most accurate image of me anyone had ever put into print. Before I tell you what the article changed, let me tell you what happened in the first 2 hours after it ran. 3 people read it whose reactions would each shift something. One of them was in a law office in Scottsdale, reaching for a telephone. One of them was somewhere over the Midwest, on a flight to Washington, D.C., reading it on her phone with the cabin lights still dim. And one of them was in a kitchen in South Phoenix, pressing her hand flat on a printed page to make sure it was real. My mother read it at the kitchen table, with her reading glasses on and her coffee going cold beside her. When she finished, she folded the page carefully and held her palm against it. Then, "Your father would have made copies for everyone at church." I had to leave the room for a minute after she said that. By 8 in the morning, my inbox held over 400 unread messages. By noon, it was past 2,000. Interview requests, partnership inquiries, a letter from a Maricopa County commissioner, a message from an engineering program in Tucson, a nonprofit in New Mexico doing parallel work who wanted to talk about joining resources. Rodney called at 8:15. I could hear the grin in his voice before he said a word.
"Brother, you are on the internet."
My wife called at 11:47. I had not heard her voice in months. I watched her name on my screen through 2 full rings before I answered. "Maurice." A pause long enough to carry its own weight. "I don't know where to start." "Start wherever you need to," I said. She told me her father's attorneys had contacted her the same morning the article ran. The equity clause, the loan-to-stake conversion built into the document she had signed at 29, had been formally activated. A preliminary claim was drafted, asserting the family's loan to the household as legal grounds for a 25% stake in the company's current valuation. She had learned about it not from her parents, but from her younger brother, the one who had always been quietly uncomfortable with how things were managed in that family. He had overheard the attorney briefing and called her immediately. Then she told me what she had spent the past weeks piecing together and carrying alone. She confirmed what the recording had already told me. Her father had contacted the early investor directly, years ago, and positioned it as protecting his daughter's financial interests. He had never told her. She confirmed what Rodney had told me. The pressure applied to him had come through a family associate. She had known there was some management of the situation. That word again, the family's preferred euphemism for what they did to the people around me. She had not asked what it meant. She had let it stay in the category of things she didn't look at too closely. Because looking too closely at certain things in that family came with its own costs. I was 29 when I signed that document, she said. I was sitting at my parents' table. My father told me it was standard family financial planning, that it protected the household if things didn't work out. I didn't have my own attorney. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't understand that I was signing something designed to follow you forever. Her voice broke once, clean and brief. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I gave up the right to ask for that. I'm telling you because you deserve the full truth. And because I already did one thing before this call. I want you to know it was my choice, not yours to make. I asked her what she had done. She had called Gerald Watkins 3 weeks before the Forbes article ran, the night after the family's attorney briefing, when she sat in her car and made the decision she had been putting off. She had asked him to send me everything he had before her family could move. She wanted me to have time to prepare. That was why the email arrived when it did. I want to stay here for a moment, because what Jamila was describing and what she had navigated in the weeks between that family meeting and this phone call is more than a plot point in this story. Psychologists who study family systems identify a pattern called delegated loyalty, the process by which a family member is unconsciously assigned the role of protecting the family's interests at the cost of their own authentic choices. From inside it, the assignment doesn't feel like coercion. It feels like love, like responsibility, like what you do for people who gave you everything and expect coherence in return. Jamila had not been a villain acting from cruelty. She had been a woman acting from fear. Fear of her family's withdrawal. Fear of choosing a man whose timeline didn't align with the respectability framework she had been raised inside. Fear of what it would mean about her own judgment if she stayed and he failed. That fear had been carefully cultivated by people who stood to benefit from it. And here is the most difficult psychological truth in this entire story. The people who damage us most completely are very often not acting from malice. They are acting from their own inherited systems of fear, dressed up over years as concern and protection. Understanding this does not require accepting the harm. It does not remove the consequences, but it changes the shape of the grief. It moves it from, he was betrayed by her, toward, they were both inside a system that cost them both something real. And that shift, from blame to understanding, is where actual healing becomes possible. 2 weeks after that phone call, I flew to Washington, D.C. for the National Innovation Summit at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center on Mount Vernon Place Northwest. Dr. Merritt's program had nominated my work for recognition in the Community Impact category. Jamila was there. She had come alone. No family representative, no attorney beside her. A gray suit, understated. She looked like a woman who had made a decision she fully understood the price of and had chosen to pay it anyway. She found me during the afternoon break in one of the side corridors. White marble walls, the distant sound of a panel session carrying through glass. She waited until the hallway had mostly cleared. Then she told me what else she wanted to do. She wanted to go further than Watkins' testimony. She wanted to give a formal statement, to the press if necessary, to the Harper Family Board of Private Interests, to whoever needed to hear it, acknowledging that the equity claim had no ethical basis, that it was constructed on a foundation of interference she had not fully understood, but bore responsibility for nonetheless. She was prepared to accept whatever legal and financial consequences followed. She would lose the family. She already knew it. Her mother had stopped returning calls the week prior. Her father had told her she was throwing away everything they had built for her. I know I can't give back the time, she said. I can't restore what your father tried to build for you, or the years in that workshop. or what the component failure cost you. I can't give any of that back. But I can make sure they don't take what you built now. I want to do that. Not so you'll forgive me, not so you think better of me, because it's right, and someone should have made it right a long time ago. What Jamila was offering in that corridor was what researchers call a reparative act, a concrete sacrifice made not to erase the harm, but to acknowledge it fully and absorb its cost. To say, I understand what this took from you, and I am willing to pay a real price to stop the bleeding. It is one of the rarest things one person can offer another, and it is genuinely complicated to receive because accepting it means acknowledging out loud that the wound was real enough to require it, that the loss was actual, that the years meant something. I stood in that hallway and looked at the woman I had once danced with at a block gathering in South Phoenix when we were both young and the whole world still felt like it had room for us. I looked at who she had become inside a family that had shaped her carefully into an instrument of its own ambitions. And I understood, for the first time clearly, that she had been losing things long before I had. That understanding didn't make the ring any quieter in my memory, but it changed what I wanted to do next. I thanked her. I told her I needed to think. I walked back into the convention center and sat through the entire afternoon session and did not absorb a single word of it. Don't leave yet, because the choice Maurice made that night is the one that reveals exactly who he had become. And it is not the choice most people would make. I called Rodney from my hotel room that night. He picked up on the second ring, a game on his television in the background. He turned it off without being asked. That small thing tells you everything you need to know about a person. I walked him through everything, what Jamila had offered, what it would cost her, what I was thinking about doing instead. He was quiet for a long moment, then, "Man, you sure?" "No," I said, "but I think it's right." "Then it probably is," he said. I called Jamila the next morning. I told her I didn't want the public statement. She started to explain her reasoning, and I let her finish. Then I said it as plainly as I could. I had built what I built without needing anyone to clear the path for me, and I had done it in spite of every obstacle that had been quietly placed in front of me. I was not going to resolve this by placing that burden on someone else's shoulders, even someone who was prepared to carry it willingly. The Harper family's equity claim would be answered through my attorneys, through documentation, through proper channels. Gerald Watkins was prepared to testify. My father's recording was preserved and authenticated. The pattern of interference, the early investor, the pressure on Rodney, the family loan reframed as a legal weapon, was coherent and documented, and it would be presented in the right rooms at the right time. What I needed from Jamila was not a public sacrifice. It was space. The chance to finish this the same way I had built everything else. On my own terms, without spectacle, without requiring someone else to absorb the cost on my behalf. "You don't owe me a public reckoning," I told her. "What you owe yourself is a real accounting of who you want to be when your family's voice is no longer the loudest one in the room. That work belongs to you. It has nothing to do with me anymore." A silence. Then, "I always believed you were going to build something that mattered. I just couldn't hold on long enough to see it." "I know," I said. I meant it without bitterness. That was the part that surprised me most, how completely I meant it, and how little it changed anything that had already been decided. Psychologists who study recovery after significant loss describe a process called meaning reconstruction, the gradual work of integrating what happened to you into a coherent story about who you are, rather than carrying it as a rupture that defines you. The difference between those two positions, wound at the center of the story versus wound that has been understood and absorbed, is the difference between bitterness and forward motion, meaning reconstruction does not happen in a hotel room after a phone call. It happens in accumulation, in ordinary moments, in the shop with Rodney, in the garden with Mrs. Caldwell, in the kitchen before dawn with a cup of coffee and a readout that finally shows what you always believed was possible. It happens when you notice, with a quiet kind of surprise, that you went a full afternoon without thinking about the ring on the floor. That is what forward motion looks like. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just the slow, steady shifting of the story's center of gravity, away from the loss, toward the work. The Harper family's attorneys responded to our documentation package 11 days after it was filed. They challenged the audio recording's chain of custody. They disputed Watkins' professional standing to testify. They characterized everything as circumstantial and inadmissible. My attorneys prepared a formal response. It took 3 weeks. In those same 3 weeks, something happened inside the Harper family that no external legal strategy could have engineered. Jamila's younger brother, the one who had called her the morning the article ran, the one who had always been quietly uncomfortable with how that family operated, notified the Harper attorneys that if the claim proceeded to litigation, he would provide a full deposition. Everything he knew, every family meeting he had been present for, every conversation he had heard. A family's unity is its most powerful legal asset. Once that unity fractures from inside, the calculus changes entirely. The claim was withdrawn 14 days later. No statement, no acknowledgement. The Harper family simply stopped. Powerful people, I have learned, do not retreat because you are right. They retreat when the cost of continuing exceeds the benefit of winning. In the end, the cost was one of their own. The new workshop opened on a Thursday morning on West Broadway Road in South Phoenix. Larger than the Tempe space, room for 3 engineers, a proper assembly line, and a small meeting area with a whiteboard I filled with projection numbers before anyone else arrived. My mother brought a sweet potato pie. She cut it on a folding table at the front door and talked to every single person there by name, because that is what Layla Rivers does. She moves through the world like someone who has never once doubted that the people in it are worth knowing. I watched her from across the parking lot and thought about my father. A USB drive in a desk drawer, a voice on a recording, steady, certain, in a room that had been arranged against him before he walked through the door. 31 years of infrastructure work, and then 8 more years of trying to give his son a running start at something bigger. About faith that doesn't require the finish line to keep running. Some weeks after the opening, I drove back to Mrs. Caldwell's garden on West Rosa Road. Late afternoon, the light long and gold across the raised beds. She was out there with her hose, tending things with the patient, unhurried attention she brought to everything. She looked up when she heard me coming and didn't seem surprised at all. I sat in the folding chair. She brought the thermos. "How's the water running?" I asked. She looked at me with that expression. Decades of watching people make things harder than they needed to be, distilled into one patient look. "Baby, that water has been running fine since the day you put it in the ground." We sat in the garden while the evening came in slow and gold. I didn't feel like someone who had won. I felt like someone who had found his way back to the work. Which, I was beginning to understand, was the better version of winning. Don't go anywhere, because the final lesson in Maurice's story is the one that stays with you the longest. And it just might be the thing you needed to hear today. This story does not end with a reconciliation. My wife did not come back. I did not ask her to. That is the part people sometimes struggle to sit with. The idea that a story about love and betrayal doesn't require love to be restored in order for the loss to have meaning. But I think that's precisely what makes it worth telling. The resolution that doesn't look like resolution until you understand it's the only honest one available. Jamila left Scottsdale. She moved to Houston, started over in a smaller role at a smaller firm, in a city where the Harper name carried no weight and no expectations. Her mother didn't speak to her for a long time. Her father told her she had thrown away everything they had built for her. I did not follow her story closely. But I heard enough, through people who knew people, to understand she was building something more honest than what she'd had. That she was figuring out, slowly and at real cost, who she was when no one in her family was watching. For her, I felt something I had not expected. A clean, uncomplicated hope. Not the tangled kind that wants something in return. Just the simple wish that she would find her way to a version of herself that didn't require anyone else's permission to breathe freely. Psychologists call this compassionate detachment, the capacity to genuinely wish well to someone who caused you significant harm, without requiring their presence in your life for that goodwill to be real. It sits precisely between bitterness on one side, which keeps the wound open and calls it honesty, and premature forgiveness on the other, which closes it too fast and calls it peace. Compassionate detachment says something different. It says, I understand what happened. I understand what you did and why and what it cost me. And I release you from the obligation to make it right. Not because what was done didn't matter, but because carrying it as resentment costs me more than it will ever cost you. And I have more important things to carry. That kind of release doesn't arrive in a single moment. It comes the same way the work came, in accumulation, day by day, until you realize you're not carrying the weight anymore, and you can't quite identify the morning it got lighter. The pilot program expanded to 3 Arizona counties and 1 in New Mexico. A municipality in Tucson entered a formal supply agreement for 20 units in underserved districts. The workshop on West Broadway Road grew to 5 engineers and a production coordinator named Deja, who ran the assembly schedule with an efficiency that made me feel slightly unnecessary in the best possible way. Rodney still asks me, every few months, when I'm going to hire enough staff that he can stop lending me his shop on weekends for overflow work. I tell him when the 4th county contract finalizes. He says, that's what I said about the 3rd one. He's right. We have this conversation over bad coffee in those bays on South Central Avenue, and it always ends with both of us laughing, which I take as evidence that we are doing something right. My mother still brings food to every opening, every milestone, every occasion that requires marking. She shows up early, she stays late. She learns every name in the room. She is 68 years old, and she has never once, in my entire life, given me the impression that the people around her were anything less than worth her full attention. I watch her sometimes and understand something I could not have articulated 3 years ago in that rainy Scottsdale parking lot. I come from people who knew how to persist before persistence had a name, who kept going not because they could see the finish line, but because stopping was incompatible with who they were. I still keep my father's USB drive in the top drawer of my desk at the workshop. Some evenings, when the engineers have gone home and the building is quiet, I play the recording. Not to grieve. To stay grounded in the truth of where the belief began, before the Forbes article, before the federal partnership, before any of the rooms that have opened their doors to me since. The belief began in a conference room 4 years before I knew it existed, with a man who spent his last months trying to clear a path for his son in a world that had not yet decided to see him. He didn't tell me he was doing it. He understood that some weights belong to the person who chooses to carry them, and that protecting someone from the full cost of loving them until they are strong enough to carry it themselves is perhaps the most generous thing one person can do for another. I try to carry that forward the same way. One evening in the garden, the light going long, Mrs. Caldwell beside me with the thermos, the readout on my tablet doing what I always believed it could do. She said something I have not stopped thinking about since. You know what the difference is between the people who make it and the ones who don't? It's not talent. It's not even hard work. She looked out over the raised beds, the neat rows, the things she had been tending long before I arrived. It's whether they can keep believing in the thing when nobody else does. Most people can't. It takes too long and it costs too much, and they need somebody to tell them it's real before they can trust that it is. She handed me the thermos. You didn't need that. That's the whole story. This story reminds us of 3 things worth writing down. Somewhere you'll see them. First, a man's value is not measured by how quickly the room recognizes it. Some of the most important work ever done was finished before anyone thought to applaud. Second, the people who hurt us most completely are often not free themselves. Understanding that won't undo the harm, but it will keep the bitterness from quietly becoming the most expensive thing you ever carried. Third, and most important, every resource, every opportunity, every door that gets quietly closed around you by someone else's hand, none of it can touch what you build inside yourself when no one is watching. That is the only asset no agreement can touch, no family can claim, and no ring bouncing on a marble floor can take away. Maurice didn't win because the world finally saw him. He won the day he decided to keep building, whether it did or not. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, empathy, and courage. AI assisted only in language refinement, so that timeless lessons of justice, compassion, and standing up against wrong could move and educate viewers everywhere.